Hello, Foreign Things viewers. With us today, I am Rob Farley, as you know, and with us today, for the first time in a little bit, is Foreign Things co-host Matt Duss. Matt, how are you this morning?
I'm very well, Rob. How are you?
I am fantastic because I have a Duckie. I have two Duckies that were awarded to us because Foreign Entanglements has won the 2016 online. I honestly don't know, but OAIS Best Podcast Award. And so right. I have two of these, one for you, and I will make sure to distribute that to you at some point in the not too distant future.
Thank you.
So for
No, that's great.
Yeah.
And a credit to you and Natalie for the great work you've done over the past year.
Right. No, we actually need a third one of these so we can send it to Natalie. Although it's also Australia, so we'll just float it to her or something along those lines. So
they have mail. Sometimes the mail runs to Australia.
I'm told that it is an intermittent thing. So anyway, I am actually here in sunny Atlanta at the International Studies Association, which is where we received the Duckie out of the normal Lexington. But today, what we're going to talk about is an article that's been out for about a week now, but has been the rage. And so we're going to start off by talking about this, but then some of the permutations in other areas, which is the Jeff Goldberg, really just huge Jeff Goldberg article on the Obama Doctrine. Which used extensive interviews with Obama and with people around Obama to try to sort out how exactly he thinks about foreign policy, which is really quite different than the way that the rest of the Washington Beltway peeps think about foreign policy.
Right.
So I guess what was immediately interesting to you when you started plowing into this article?
Well, I wrote a piece that's out today in Tablet magazine. Where I, looking it over, reading it over, as I write in the piece, what really I kept coming back to that statement of Obama's during the January 2008, or in January 2008 in a primary debate with Hillary Clinton, where he responded to a question about Iraq, saying, "Listen, I don't want to just end the war. I want to end the mindset that got us into the war in the first place." And I remember that moment. I remember sitting there watching it, just my eyes going wide. It's like, wow, that's a big statement. And I know that a number of other foreign policy analysts on the progressive side took very serious note of that, because it wasn't just that the Iraq War was wrong. It wasn't just that it was a mistake of the Bush administration. What he was saying, and what I think this article makes clear in greater detail, is that the Iraq War, the disaster that came there, was the result of a whole way of thinking about foreign policy and American power in Washington. And this piece is Obama's account of his efforts and his struggle and his engagement with that way of thinking and his efforts to change it, and often failing and sometimes succeeding. Right.
And that also sort of that linking back to that and thinking back to that also occurred to me, and I read your piece this morning. It was excellent. What struck me the most, and this kind of interests me, and I know that Foreign Entanglements viewers will know I've had this conversation with Tom Nichols, and I've had this conversation with David Bernstein-Ross, that Obama doesn't believe in the credibility theory. He doesn't believe in the resolve theory, right? And he specifically called out the rest of the think tanks and everyone who believes that the United States has to step up in places it doesn't want to, just to preserve credibility. It was really interesting.
Right, and that was a great, I say great, but a very troubling episode in there where Secretary of State Clinton, Kerry was Secretary of State at the time, but Clinton is interviewed. Where she says, well, if we draw a red line and say we're going to bomb, we have to bomb. And that's very troubling. The idea that, well, we said we were going to do something, and it might be stupid, but we need to do it because our credibility. Now, bombing may or may not have been the right decision, but to say you need to do it just because you said it to preserve your quote-unquote credibility, I mean, that's the credibility fairy right there.
Right.
But I think, there's been an ongoing discussion about credibility over the last few years. And there were a number of good pieces that came out. I think Zach Beecham at Vox wrote a very good piece, just drawing out that one element of the piece right after it came out. But it's not necessarily, and tell me if you disagree, I mean, it's not necessarily that credibility does not exist and it's not a thing. It's just that the idea that you can, establish credibility or diminish credibility by any single discrete action, that's the real problem, right?
Right. Well,
the idea that you can force your adversary to think a certain thing about you by doing thing A or thing B.
Right. The problem with messages that are intended to send credibility, intended to express resolve, is that, and so the classic formulation here, and Obama sort of pushed back on this directly. Classic formulation that's been brought up recently is that by not going with the Syrian red line, we demonstrated a lack of resolve, and therefore the Russians then took Crimea.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the problem with that is that something, and when you think about the Syrian red line in this way, then it's a message, right? It's a message to the Russians that they have to act in a certain way, or that they will be punished. But that message rarely gets through, right? Is the first problem, and that message may be a lie. And there was a follow-up piece to the Goldberg article, which asked actual Russian foreign policymakers whether this message had been important, and they were flabbergasted. Right? It's like, look, you can bomb Syria all you want. That doesn't matter for Russia, right? We're a nuclear superpower. We take what we want.
Right.
And Obama made the point himself. He's like, look, does no one remember that this country invaded Georgia while there was a belligerent U.S. president who liked invading countries, right? It doesn't matter.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, I think that's been a valuable. I mean, if you look at the impact that Obama and his approach to foreign policy has had on Washington, I think that is one example of that discussion that's been very valuable. And as I note in the piece, it's it remains to be seen how enduring the change is. Obama, I think, hasn't ended the mindset. I think he would admit that. I think it still exists. It's deeply entrenched. There's something very, very attractive and inspiring about the idea that American power is magic. Mm-hmm. And I say that, jokingly, but with some respect for, colleagues in Washington who work on these issues in very, very good faith.
Right. I mean, the I've read your book, Samantha line sort of left out, right? And it's kind of left out in both ways, right? Because I imagine that you could, having those conversations with her over and over again about the use of U.S. power. But it did sort of was evocative of how Obama thinks about this and what some of the costs of that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is one of the things, his understanding of how ideas are, formed and shared and institutionalized in Washington, and how certain tendencies are privileged against others, and the reasons for that. A lot of it having to do with money and funding, and you don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole there, but I think anyone who's being honest would admit that the willingness of certain donor foundations and individuals to support certain ideas about foreign policy they like, and this is true across all policy areas, tend to privilege and strengthen, or at least get a much broader, bigger hearing for certain ideas than for others.
Right, and Obama's a pretty pointed critique, and I think it's fair to say that it's no secret to anyone that Obama and Bibi don't get along. But Obama also had just a fairly pointed critique of virtually every Arab leader in the Middle East, and what I don't know if anybody has sort of decided to write a book about this and capitalize both of these terms, but the Arab lobby. His critique of this was quite pointed. But all you would have to go back to, if you went back in time, you would find a China lobby or something along those lines. But a sense of how those organizations work and how they affect the domestic conversation is really very interesting coming out of this.
Yeah, and I think it's yes, there is a pro-Arab lobby, there is a pro-Israel lobby. I don't think anyone deny those things, and they're very well organized and funded at getting their ideas discussed and often implemented in policy. But let's step back and look at what I think is the key, or at least one of a very small handful of most important policy items, and that's the Iran agreement. And in that case, the Arab lobby and the Israel lobby failed to stop an agreement that they very, very clearly opposed, energetically, aggressively. I remember back in, after the interim agreement, in November 2013. So this is December 2013 and January 2014. There was this huge alarm amongst the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and it was amazing to me as someone who works on Middle East policy. Over that course of that 2 months, the amount of energy resources that were spent in Washington to push back against this Iran agreement. I mean, I literally could have eaten breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day of the week, talking with some official or analyst or some person from that region who was going to tell me about how dangerous this deal was, and here are all the reasons why. But it does show that as strong as those factions are in Washington, if you have an administration who's committed, working with working with civil society partners as Obama did in support of the Iran deal, that you can make a really important change and achieve something, I think, very significant for U.S. security. And as I note in the piece, and I've noted elsewhere, I think the Iran deal, more than anything else, demonstrates exactly Obama's vision of how to use American power. Yeah. How to advance American power by working with partners in multilateral organizations to mobilize consensus.
How many F-15s and F-16s do we have to send to Jordan and Saudi Arabia before we stop here talk about how we have aligned with Iran? I mean, it's crazy.
Right. Yeah,
it's madness. The U.S. and Iran do not behave like allies behave. We don't send them guns. We do send you guns. Right. I mean, Mm-hmm. What's up?
Right. We don't lobby the UN to create special rapporteurs for human rights in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or So the idea that there's this realignment is just obviously ridiculous on its face, but I think it does go, just to the idea that the Saudis and other Gulf countries have become so, entitled to this idea that they are America's favorite, and America will be there to solve their problems and to defend their privileges in the region against the encroachments, or even just the kind of the idea that Iran might have a place or a role to play in the region. And again, this is not to say that Iran doesn't do a lot of bad things in the region. It most certainly does. But I think Obama has laid out in numerous places his vision of the future in which Iran, as an historic player in the region, has a role to play, and hopefully will be a productive and not disruptive one. And I don't see why anyone would find that controversial.
Right. So anyway, we had mentioned that we were talking a little bit about this, and the report is still coming out, right, but fresh this morning. But it's in the same area and has to do with the same issues with the Obama administration. Fresh out this morning, so the Fox News is going to have an interview with Bob Gates a little bit later today, in which he distances himself from decision making with respect to Mubarak. And the reports are still sketchy, but it seems to suggest that Gates and other people within the administration were leaning pretty heavily on throwing U.S. support behind Mubarak, and that Obama squelched that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I saw the initial report, and what it said was that the national security staff, the council, all his advisors wanted to handle it differently. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll have to wait and see whether this means they all wanted to just back Mubarak. I'd be kind of surprised if that were the case. I'm not surprised at all that some wanted him to handle it differently. I mean, but there's two things about this. One, just this presumption that with, tens of thousands of Egyptians in the streets, that it's the role of the U.S. to kind of step in and say, no, all that freedom, democracy stuff, just, settle down, folks. We're going to hang with this dictator that we've been working with. I think that presumption is part of the problem that Obama was trying to confront, and I think we should all still try to confront. But another part of it is, okay, I can see the way we might have handled it a bit more gently instead of just straight up coming out and saying, yeah, time for you to go. We appreciate all the work you've done for us for the past 3 decades.
Now head straight to prison with you.
Now. Yeah, exactly. and yet a third thing is like, I will be very interested to see what comes out of all the people who've insisted for all these years that if only Obama had spoken out in favor of the Green Movement, that Iran would have a new democratic government now. The idea that by not making a speech, Obama somehow doomed the very immediate possibility of the overthrow of the Iranian regime, which I've always found to be completely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I have never seen anyone describe any plausible, set of events, by which Obama says something, does something, mm-hmm. and then we get democratic change in Iran.
But there are a lot of green Twitters. I mean,
Oh, there are.
That might
no, listen, and I should say, I would love for the Green Movement to succeed. I think, I favor regime change coming out of Iran. I just don't think it's, I think the U.S. can do a number of things, and frankly, I think Obama has been doing a number of things, to help facilitate that. He could probably do a little bit more. I mean, as I joked earlier, but it's true, I think the creation of the Special Rapporteur for Human Rights on Iran has been an enormous boost to Iranian human rights activists in their efforts to kind of keep focus on the regime and its abuses. But, that disconnect between, we want to overthrow this government because it opposes us, but we should support this dictator because he's been an ally. All right, that's a pretty hard, realist way to look at things. You can make that argument, but I would love to see people kind of reconcile these two things, so I guess we'll see.
I mean, so... And you talked a little bit about this in your piece, and some other people have also sort of made this point, is that the way that Goldberg frames it, there's something to be said for, sure, the way that Obama approaches it sounds, there are a lot of ways to like how he approaches it. But if we start talking about terms of outcomes in the Middle East, there are three big things here, and we can even lump the Egyptian thing into this, right? Is that, disengaging with Iraq to the extent we disengaged in 2010 was problematic, right? I mean, who knows how things would have worked out differently? Not intervening as forcefully as we could have in 2012, and this is before all the red line nonsense, right? But when there was a chance where the moderate Syrian rebels were more moderate and had a chance to win, was also an area where, look, you can say there was a real upside here. And with Mubarak, right? I mean, look, I got rid of Mubarak, but now you have an even more repressive dictator in Egypt. So, what is all this non-intervention buying you in terms of positive stuff either for the United States or for the region?
Yeah, no, and that's a very fair question. I mean, first on Syria, as I noted in the piece, I, like many others, have thought about this constantly, and I am deeply unsatisfied with the idea that the United States could not have changed this outcome, and yet, I really don't see. I don't see how. And I'm not looking for a cookie here just because I'm saying that. I don't need to be congratulated for my sorrow about this, but I'm just saying, like, if there was a plan that didn't simply put this on the U.S.'s plate, because I think that's what an intervention would do. All of a sudden, we'd become responsible for this in a whole new set of ways that I don't see any good outcome from. Right. But Iraq, I think, is slightly different. Now, I think the whole idea that the surge saved Iraq and then Obama squandered that is just nonsense. I think the surge, to my surprise, and I think yours as well, did a lot more than we expected it to in terms of security. I was very, very skeptical of the ability of to create a better security situation under the circumstances of foreign occupation, and yet it seemed to have worked. But I think some of the steps that were taken there, supporting these Sunni tribes to go against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there have been reports on this, including a very, very good one by my colleagues at the Center for American Progress back in, I think, 2009, that examined the ways that the surge strategy actually froze into place a whole set of political divisions in Iraq that really undermined the political part of the surge strategy, which completely failed. People should remember that there was a military and a political strategy to the surge. The military seems to have succeeded. The political did not, and it's that lack of political resolution, the lack of dealing with those divisions, which have become more entrenched, which allowed the security situation to eventually deteriorate because Sunnis in Iraq felt completely alienated, completely unrepresented by the government, which was run by a Shiite leader, Nouri al-Maliki, who began to behave very much like a mini Saddam. So by pulling, I think it was the right move to pull the troops out, but I think it's the political disengagement from Iraq. You know, the fact that Obama didn't really make you, from my perspective, and I know I've heard this from others who worked in Iraq, that Obama really seemed to really want to put Iraq aside in its entirety. And it seems to me it would have been entirely consistent with Obama's vision of using diplomacy and using other tools other than the military tool to achieve American goals to really maintain or increase that political and diplomatic engagement to deal with some of those problems.
Right, and it's not as if we shouldn't be glassy-eyed about this, right? I mean, the policy of non-intervention has, in the case of Iraq, led to more intervention in Iraq, right? I mean, we are now as involved in Iraq as we were trying definitely not to be in 2010, right?
Right.
We are actively attempting to reconstitute the Iraqi military, and there seems to be some success on that.
Right.
We're bombing the heck out of both Iraq and Syria every day. We're calling the places we're bombing ISIS. We have not succeeded in disengaging. We have not succeeded in disengaging. And whatever you want to call, I mean, I think that the Obama, and we'll have to see a little bit more about when we get some more retrospectives. The Obama strategy on Syria in 2011-12 was pretty straightforwardly intended to avoid Libya, right? It was that you didn't want to support the rebels so much that they completely tore down the Syrian state, but you wanted to support them enough that eventually someone would convince Assad to go, and you'd have some sort of coalition government. Otherwise, you might get rebels butchering Alawites, you might get rebels butchering Christians, right? Two communities which have been very supportive of the Assad regime. However sort of good and nuanced and sensible that policy seems, and we talked about it now, it still seems sensible. It failed utterly, right? It was a complete failure. Right? And now we're engaged in both places. But that's also part of this whole thing about taking sides in foreign policy, is that you do have to look full-faced on your failures and figure out what to do next. Yeah. And quite arguably, at least both of these, the failures, they may be failures, but they cost the United States much, much, much less than the failures of the Bush administration, right? Which we're still paying for.
Right. Yes. And as we're talking about this, we spent the first 20 minutes of talking about this article focused on the Middle East. And, to be fair, I work for an organization called the Foundation for Middle East Peace. That's my area of focus. But I think, part of what the article really brings out is Obama's effort to, draw down America's overcommitment to the Middle East, to right size America's, investment in the region. And, the pivot to Asia is the quote. I often joke that, well, the Middle East is technically part of Asia. But, to East Asia, China, and the Pacific region, understanding that America has so much more work to do in that area. And, even though the Middle East is someplace I study, it's a region that I really love for all its problems. I do get the wisdom of that, needing to kind of to amp up America's policy work and its commitment to some of these other areas.
Well, Latin Americans love Latin America, but they're also pretty happy when the United States turns its gaze away from Latin America. So,
sort of a history there.
So, what do you think about the distinction between sort of how Obama frames his foreign policy in this Goldberg article and what foreign policy looks like, sort of Clinton's approach to foreign policy? And there's one area in which there is, and I don't think Goldberg makes this point, but there's one area in which there is considerable agreement, right? That Clinton and Obama are co-architects of the pivot to Asia, and there's every reason to believe that Clinton is very serious about pivoting to Asia. But there seem to be a lot of other places where you're talking about some pretty significant divergences in their approach.
Yeah, I'm not. I think there are some divergences. I'm not sure how significant. Clinton is clearly more hawkish. She's clearly more on the interventionist side. I think the argument that she's a neocon is sort of silly. Um, I do think even though Clinton was the first one to really attack Obama's Iran policy as naive back in 2008, to her great credit, when she became Secretary of State, she did really enormous work to implement that policy. She's the one who opened the back channel with Iran, even before the election of Rouhani in 2013, through Oman, which was a key step in, I think, getting to that final nuclear agreement. As a candidate, she has fully owned the Iran agreement. In fact, when at the Brookings Institution, I think this is last fall, she gave what I think is the single best defense of the Iran nuclear agreement, and that's including from Obama, who's given some pretty good ones. She just went down the whole line of why this was good. It's not perfect, but it's good for American security. It's good for our partners, and actually describing a vision, I think, very close to Obama's about how American power should work in the 21st century and all the different tools that we can and should use to advance it. But yeah, she's been in favor of some of the, she was in favor of the Libya intervention. She clearly wanted to go into Syria. So, once she's in office, as I think she will be, but let's just, for the sake of argument, once she's in office, how she'll react to being the one to make these decisions, that can change people. But yeah, I mean, just the bottom line is, she tends more hawkish, but I don't see a huge divergence from Obama. Do you disagree?
It's interesting, right? Because a lot of the decisions that Goldberg talks about here are sort of really close, and they're almost instinctual, right? And so a lot of what he talks about, Obama came really, really close to bombing Syria, right? I mean, it was really, he made the decision to bomb Syria, and then he backed away, and then didn't do it, right? And he was really close on Libya. He was like 51-49 on Libya, and she helped push him over. And so, I mean, I guess one of the things about reading this was that, these small, almost incremental but very detail-oriented decisions that really can make a pretty big difference. And so you look at what a Clinton administration would have done in foreign policy over the past 8 years, and it's a potentially very different world. I mean, one in which the United States is more engaged in the Syrian war, and the war has a very different character. And that's, that right there just, kind of implies. But, listen, a point you made at the end of your tablet article is that it's a really weird conversation to be talking about Barack Obama as an anti-interventionist president when he's bombed like dozens of countries, right? Nobody even knows how many countries. Even he doesn't know how many countries he's bombed. It's just like, where are we that you can bomb random countries around the world and still be the non-interventionist candidate, right? And in some sense, right, and sometimes I tell this to his critics on the left, right, his instincts are as anti-interventionist as you will likely ever see from an American president in our lifetime. Right. But, right, we still bomb lots of countries on a daily basis, right?
Right. And I was just chuckling about that, and that's horrible and part of the problem.
Right. Well, from the sublime to the absurd. So,
well, before we move on, and I do want to get to the absurd because it is very absurd, but just to kind of agree with your point, I think it's a very good one that some of these decisions are very close, but that going the other way could create a completely different reality. Certainly in terms of U.S. engagement in Syria and all that. And the one area that I do have concern with Clinton, and I'll use, again, the Iran agreement and the Iran policy as an example, is that in her defenses of the deal and her description of how she would carry forward from that, she has really tended to underplay or not even mention the importance of the kind of outreach to the Iranian people and demonstrating to Iran that, the U.S. isn't the problem here. Her rhetoric tends to be much more aggressive. And this goes back to, I think it was during the campaign or even during one of her testimonies, I don't remember, but this is years ago, where she said something to the effect, well, if Iran steps out of line, we'll just obliterate them. And, sure, that sounds tough, but that's a problem in international relations. That's a problem when you're trying to demonstrate to a country that you're not the recalcitrant party, you're not the problem. And I think that's something that Obama recognized and did very, very well. If you go back to his inauguration speech in 2009, his first Nowruz greeting, and all the Nowruz greetings he's done, this effort to demonstrate to the Iranian people that the U.S. has no real beef with you. We have a beef with your government and the stuff they are doing.
Right.
And I think that was an enormous asset to just creating internal pressure. Now, it's possible to overstate that, and we shouldn't do that, but I do think, I think Iranians themselves, many of them, I could run down the list, have recognized that the American president sending this message to the Iranian people was a powerful form of pressure, or at least created another kind of pressure on the regime. So I would hope that she would, get that a bit more, but we'll see. So
right. So from this sort of mild temperamental disagreement to a group of people who, if you've only promised to obliterate Iran 3 times today, then you haven't promised enough. Let's talk about Ted Cruz and his new group of folks. Now, our mutual friend Eli had just a fantastic article on this, and the headline was well, it was something along the lines of Doris Kearns Goodwin, right? That you have that Cruz has brought together a foreign policy team with all sorts of diverging attitudes. And they run the gamut from Frank Gaffney to Michael Ledeen. Yeah.
Right. Yes, you've got Elliot Abrams and Michael Ledeen holding down the more reasonable side. I thought that was absolutely beautiful.
Oh, man.
That's like we've got both kinds of music, country and western.
Right. Fantastic. So, I mean, what is fascinating to me, and I let you talk a little bit about Frank Gaffney, but what's fascinating to me is that, the last week or 2 weeks ago, I can't remember when it was now, this big letter from all these, the Never Trump letter, right, which from all of these foreign policy people associated with the Republican side talking about, oh my goodness, Donald Trump is just crazy, he says all these crazy things, we can never stand by him, #Never Trump. And, a lot of people at the time were saying, look, a lot of the people who signed this letter are pretty damn crazy. And now they all work for Trump. Or not Trump, for Cruz, right? It's
Cruz.
It's crazy. Yeah. It's fascinating.
Yeah, right. No, and I should say, and I know you've said as well. I mean, I know and respect a number of the people on there, but yes, a number of them hold views that are every bit as extreme. But their attitude and the way they talk about it might be a little bit more polite. They don't make oblique references to their genitals the way that Trump might.
Right.
But I think that seemed to me to be the main thing, because if you look at those positions that are listed in that letter. These outrageous positions that make Trump unacceptable. Cruz and Rubio, by the way, even though he's gone now, hold a number of those positions.
Pour one out for Rubio.
Right. But now we're talking about Cruz. I mean, support for torture. Well, Cruz is totally there. All kinds of you've got the anti-Muslim bigotry thing, which, yes, I think it's great that you've got Republican establishment experts condemning this. But I think just focusing on Trump doesn't do it. I mean, now especially that you've got Cruz naming Frank Gaffney, who's kind of, the Colonel Sanders of anti-Muslim bigotry in Washington, who has been behind just this whole menu of crazy conspiracy theories, even before President Obama. And this is a guy who was claiming that the Bush administration was infiltrated by Muslim Brotherhood agents. For Cruz to put him up as, someone who he's talking to and formulating his foreign policy is crazy. And I do want to use that word. It is crazy. Both, I mean, it's in so many ways. Two of the most important ways. One is, yes, it's just offensive to, I think, Americans, Muslim or not. The things that Gaffney has said, and I've written about this when I was at the Center for American Progress. We published a number of reports on the Islamophobia network, of which Gaffney is a very, very prominent figure. It's essentially a form of religious discrimination. Gaffney offers this interpretation of Islamic Sharia law, which is to say that anyone who follows Sharia is essentially an agent committed to the destruction of the United States, which is to say any observant Muslim is a potential danger to the United States. Now, that is both ridiculous and offensive, but it's also strategically just totally counterproductive. Essentially, what this gang of activists are saying is that when ISIS and Al-Qaeda and these other Islamic extremists claim that America and Islam are incompatible, they are saying, yes, you are correct. America and Islam are incompatible. And now think about the message this sends to some alienated, disaffected young American Muslim, some potential recruit anywhere in the world. Now, again, I don't want to get into this, I want to focus on the American, religious freedom and civil rights aspect. That is what's most offensive to me. But I think we cannot ignore the extent to which this aids and affirms the propaganda of extremists around the world.
Right. No, and right. There's no question, and it's always hard to figure out what motivates a particular extremist. But in this case, it's just I think what this brings out, is just that the seeds of Trumpism are very firmly within the Republican Party, right? And they have been there for quite a long time. Trump is not an alien presence, except attitudinally, right? As you pointed out, right? It's just an attitudinal difference. And this is one that I like to go back. But Mike Doran and Matt Kroenig, Matt Kroenig took time out of his day to pen an article that wasn't about bombing Iran, right? It's still time to bomb Iran, 2028 version. To write this, glorious article to the glory of Scott Walker, and how he would face down the Ayatollahs on day one, just like he faced down those teachers' unions in Wisconsin. And it's embarrassing stuff. Right, and it's not even in degree different from the stuff that Trump is saying, right? It's embarrassing, silly nonsense, and yet both of their names are on the Trump list, right? And the problem, the Trump is in the House. He's calling from inside the House, right? Why you people can't understand that,
right?
As they do, never Trump hashtags. It's just madness to me.
Yeah. No, I think that is the main takeaway, and is that this bigotry problem, this craziness problem, is much bigger than Trump. Trump has exploited it very, very effectively. The main challenge he represents to the Republican establishment is that they just have no leverage over him. And I think that, the fact that all these people have now gravitated to Cruz as an acceptable choice, even though, as you say, when you examine Cruz's actual ideas, his actual policies, there's a difference only in degree or in the extent that Cruz can discuss these ideas with a bit more policy language that's acceptable and makes tails wag here in Washington, but they're still every bit as crazy, if not crazier. I mean, let's recognize, even though Trump is a disaster, Trump has the less crazy position on Iran.
Oh, he does.
He has the less crazy position on Israel, Palestine. He speaks the complete truth about the Iraq War being a disaster. He speaks the complete truth about the fact that 9/11 happened on George Bush's watch, and this idea that George W. Bush kept us safe has a pretty big asterisk next to it.
Yeah, there was an ad, an attack ad put out against Trump like 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm sure you saw this. That it was like the Veterans of American Wars or something like that. Some after George Bush. And it's an attack ad, and it has Trump saying basically everything that you just said. And all you can do is watch it and go, oh my God, this man is genuinely more sane than the people who are around him, right? And you're everything you're saying here is that you're using this to attack him. It's like, wow.
Right. No, and I think the danger is, like, who knows what Trump's going to wake up one morning and might want to do. Even though he'll say these things, and sure, if you look at the statement he made on this day and the policies he's described versus these other policies, they may look better. I think the danger, and Jeet here has made this point, the problem with Trump is that he's chaotic evil. Who knows, what he might, how can you actually work with that? And I thought you'd appreciate
Ted Cruz,
player.
Only neutral evil. Vote Cruz.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts on the Cruz team of rivals?
No, not really. I mean, I guess we'll have one thought, and I've made this point to people.
Yeah.
Sort of the really fascinating aspect of this electoral cycle is less Trump in some sense than it is just really how consequential it is that people who know Ted Cruz genuinely seem to dislike him so intensely, right? And that this, as much as anything else, sort of has prevented the coalescing around Ted Cruz that everybody, including myself, including Asa, or everyone else, really expected to happen. That just the personal animus that everyone in the Republican Party seems to have towards Ted Cruz as a human being. That's what really is crazy about this cycle, right? Because Trump-esque figures have appeared before, but the inability to coalesce around Ted Cruz is really fascinating.
Yeah,
and maybe he'll get on with Frank Gaffney. Who knows?
But yesterday there was Lindsey Graham announcing that he would support Cruz in one of the more awkward and painful television interviews I've ever seen. I mean, this is Graham who said that choosing between Cruz and Trump was like choosing between being poisoned and being shot. But he's poison I can learn to like now. So I'll be. But what it says to me is that yes, you're totally right. I mean, the kind of how long it's taken for even people to come out and kind of tiptoe toward Cruz now that the Trump reality really looms and presents itself has been interesting. But what I see is that any Republican establishment, and time will tell. I'll be proven right or wrong, but a Republican establishment that can make peace with Ted Cruz to avert the disaster of a Trump is a Republican establishment that can make peace with Trump to avert the disaster of a Clinton.
Right. No, I think that's true.
So maybe we can just end on that unless you have any other final jokes.
No. Well,
okay.
The viewers for Entanglements, thank you once again for watching.
Thank you. Great to be back.
And thank you once again for any of you who went and did sign us up and for the nomination for the Duckies, which we share this award with you. I mean, it's really more ours than you guys, but we share this award for the fans. Matt, great, absolutely great having you back.
All right, Rob.
All right.
Great doing it. Talk to you later.